Sometimes the most ordinary person in the most extraordinary place becomes the hero nobody saw coming. When bullets fly and chaos reigns, when trained warriors face their darkest hour, it's not always the one with the biggest gun or the most medals who saves the day.
Sometimes it's the person everyone overlooks, the one who serves quietly in the background, whose courage emerges when everything else falls apart. This is the story of how one man's simple act of bravery in a kitchen changed the fate of an entire military operation and reminded everyone that heroism comes in all forms. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Sentinel as Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Sullivan adjusted his tactical vest one more time. The remote outpost in Afghanistan's Helmand province had been his team's home for 3 months now, and every sunrise brought the same mixture of routine and tension that defined life in a combat zone.
The base perched on a strategic hill overlooking a vital supply route, its concrete walls and razor wire offering protection for the 200 soldiers, contractors, and support staff who kept this lonely outpost running.
Sullivan had seen plenty of action in his 15 years as a Navy SEAL, but FOB Sentinel felt different.
The intelligence reports had been increasingly troubling over the past weeks. Taliban forces were massing in the surrounding mountains, and intercepted communications suggested something big was brewing. The local population had grown distant. Children who once waved at passing patrols now disappeared when American vehicles approached. Even the interpreters seemed nervous, their usual chatter replaced by worried glances and hushed conversations.
The SEAL team's mission at Sentinel was straightforward on paper but complex in execution. They were tasked with training Afghan National Army units while conducting targeted raids against high-value Taliban commanders in the region. It was the kind of mission that required both warrior skills and diplomatic finesse, demanding that they be teachers by day and hunters by night. Sullivan's 8-man team was among the most experienced in the Navy, each member hand-picked for their expertise and ability to work in the gray areas, where military operations met political reality. As Sullivan made his way to the morning briefing, he passed through the dining facility where the familiar sounds and smells of breakfast preparation filled the air. Behind the serving counter, a stocky man with graying temples worked methodically, his movements precise despite the seeming chaos around him. Tommy Chen had been the head cook at FOB Sentinel for 18 months, longer than most of the military personnel stationed there. At 52, the former Marine had found his calling in feeding soldiers, bringing a touch of home to men and women thousands of miles from everything familiar. Chen's story was one of quiet service and hidden depths. He had enlisted in the Marines right out of high school in Los Angeles, serving 2 tours in Iraq as an infantry rifleman before an IED explosion left him with a damaged left leg and a medical discharge. The transition to civilian life had been difficult, filled with odd jobs and a struggle to find purpose. When the opportunity arose to work as a contractor feeding troops overseas, Chen jumped at the chance. It wasn't combat, but it was service. And for him, that was enough. What most people at the base didn't know was that Chen's unassuming exterior concealed a wealth of tactical knowledge. His infantry experience, combined with 18 months of observing base operations, had given him insights that few others possessed.
He understood defensive positions, supply lines, and the subtle rhythms that revealed a base's vulnerabilities. More importantly, he had the kind of situational awareness that comes from years of staying alive in dangerous places.
Sullivan nodded to Chen as he passed, one professional acknowledging another. The SEAL had noticed that the cook often worked late into the night preparing meals for the next day, but also walking the perimeter during his breaks. Chen had the habits of a soldier who never quite stopped being vigilant, and Sullivan respected that dedication. The morning briefing confirmed Sullivan's growing concerns.
Captain Maria Rodriguez, the base commander, stood before a room filled with tired faces and worried expressions. The intelligence officer's report painted a grim picture of increasing enemy activity, with drone footage showing unusual movement in the surrounding hills and valleys. Supply convoys were reporting more frequent attacks, and several nearby outposts had gone silent over the past week. "Gentlemen and ladies," Captain Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the weight of command, "we have reason to believe that FOB Sentinel has been marked as a target for a major coordinated attack.
Intelligence suggests that a coalition of Taliban and foreign fighter cells has been planning an assault designed to overrun our position and capture sensitive materials and personnel." The room fell silent as she continued, clicking through satellite images that showed the stark reality of their situation. "We're essentially alone out here for the next 72 hours. Weather has grounded air support, and the nearest reinforcement is a 6-hour drive through hostile territory.
We're going to have to hold this position with what we have." Sullivan studied the tactical display showing FOB Sentinel's layout.
The base was well designed for defense, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions, but it had been built to withstand harassment attacks, not a full-scale assault by hundreds of determined fighters. The perimeter consisted of concrete barriers, concertina wire, and guard towers positioned at strategic intervals. Inside the perimeter, the various buildings were arranged to provide cover and concealment for defenders, with the command center and ammunition depot located in the most protected area. The SEAL team's role in the base's defense plan was crucial. As the most experienced combat unit on base, they would serve as a rapid reaction force, moving to wherever the attack was heaviest and coordinating the overall defense. Sullivan's men were professionals, but 8 SEALs and 92 other personnel against potentially overwhelming odds would test even their considerable skills. As the briefing concluded and personnel dispersed to their defensive preparations, Sullivan found himself walking through the base with new eyes. Every building, every position, every piece of equipment was now evaluated through the lens of survival. The mechanics working on vehicles, the communications specialists maintaining equipment, the medics preparing aid stations, all of them would soon be tested in ways they might never have imagined. The afternoon brought increased activity as the base transformed itself from a relatively relaxed forward operating post into a fortress preparing for siege. Sandbags appeared around critical positions, ammunition was distributed to defensive positions, and non-essential personnel were moved to protected areas. The base's defensive plan called for a layered approach, with outer perimeters designed to slow and channel attackers into killing zones where the defenders' superior firepower could be brought to bear. Sullivan's team spent the day conducting final reconnaissance of their assigned sectors and coordinating with the other units that would be fighting alongside them. The Afghan National Army soldiers assigned to the base were a mixed group. Some were experienced fighters who had been battling the Taliban for years, while others were new recruits still learning the basics of military life.
Their American advisors spoke cautiously, optimistic about their capabilities. But everyone knew that combat had a way of revealing both strengths and weaknesses that training could never fully predict. As evening approached, the first signs of the coming storm began to appear. Radio intercepts picked up increased enemy communications, and observation posts reported seeing small groups of fighters moving through the distant hills. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had experienced Taliban tactics: small reconnaissance teams probing for weaknesses, testing response times, and gathering intelligence for the main assault force. Chen continued his kitchen duties throughout the preparations, but Sullivan noticed that the cook was paying careful attention to everything happening around him. During his breaks, Chen would walk the perimeter, his experienced eyes taking in defensive positions and potential weak points. When questioned by curious guards, he would simply say he was checking on his supply deliveries or taking a smoke break, but his movements had the purposeful quality of a man conducting his own tactical assessment. The dining facility had taken on special importance as the base prepared for battle. It would serve as both a feeding station for the defenders and a casualty collection point if the medical facilities became overwhelmed. Chen had rearranged the kitchen equipment to ensure maximum efficiency while also creating clear pathways for wounded personnel. His years of experience had taught him that in combat situations, adaptation and flexibility were often more valuable than rigid adherence to established procedures. As darkness fell over Fob Sentinel, the tension became almost tangible. Guard towers that had been routine posting during peacetime now carried the weight of life and death responsibility. Communications equipment that had handled routine reports now buzzed with urgent updates and tactical information. Every shadow beyond the perimeter wire could conceal an enemy fighter. Every sound in the darkness could signal the beginning of the assault everyone knew was coming. Sullivan made his final rounds, checking on his team members and ensuring that weapons and equipment were ready for immediate use. Each SEAL was positioned at a critical point in the base's defensive scheme, ready to respond to threats or reinforce positions as needed. Their night vision equipment, advanced communications gear, and years of training gave them significant advantages, but Sullivan knew that advantages could disappear quickly once the shooting started. The base's early warning systems consisted of motion sensors, thermal imaging cameras, and human observers in guard towers positioned around the perimeter. These systems had been tested and refined over months of operation, but tonight they would face their ultimate test. Intelligence estimates suggested that the attack could come from multiple directions simultaneously, designed to overwhelm the defenders and prevent effective coordination of the defense. Chen finished his evening meal preparation and cleaning duties, but instead of retiring to his quarters as usual, he remained in the dining facility. His official duties were complete, but something kept him there, a soldier's intuition that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours. He moved quietly through the facility, double-checking supplies and equipment, his movements betraying the nervous energy that comes before combat. The kitchen itself had been designed with security in mind, its location near the center of the base providing protection from small arms fire and mortar attacks. The building's construction was robust enough to withstand anything short of a direct hit from heavy weapons, making it a natural fallback position if the outer defenses were breached. Chen had observed these defensive characteristics during his months at the base. filing away information that might prove useful if circumstances required him to fight rather than cook. As the hours passed, the reports from observation posts became increasingly ominous. Thermal imaging was picking up movement patterns consistent with large groups of fighters maneuvering into assault positions. Radio intercepts suggested multiple cells coordinating their movements, with attack times synchronized to maximize the element of surprise. The Taliban had learned from previous defeats, developing tactics that leveraged their numerical superiority while minimizing their exposure to American firepower advantages. Sullivan found himself thinking about the 100 different ways an attack might unfold, running through contingencies and backup plans that might mean the difference between holding the base and losing it. His team was as ready as they could be, but in combat, preparation could only take you so far.
At some point, training and equipment gave way to courage, determination, and sometimes simple luck. The final intelligence briefing before the expected attack painted a sobering picture.
Enemy forces were estimated at between 300 and 500 fighters, a mix of Taliban regulars, foreign fighters with significant combat experience, and local militia units seeking to prove themselves against American forces. Their weapons included small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and possibly vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. Most concerning was intelligence suggesting that some attackers might have insider knowledge of the base's defensive plans and vulnerabilities. Captain Rodriguez's final address to the garrison was brief and direct. They would hold FOB's Sentinel against all odds, protecting both the strategic position and each other. Air support would come as soon as weather permitted, but until then they were on their own. Every person on the base, regardless of their military occupational specialty, was now a defender responsible for the collective survival of everyone inside those concrete walls. Chen listened to the captain's words from the dining facility, where he was making final preparations for what might be a very long night. He had seen combat before, had felt the mixture of fear and determination that comes when survival depends on training, courage, and the person fighting next to you. Tomorrow's battle would test everyone on the base in ways they might never have imagined, revealing character and courage that peacetime service could never fully measure. As midnight approached, FOB Sentinels settled into the tense quiet that precedes combat. Guards maintained their vigilance, watching sectors of fire and listening for sounds that might herald the beginning of the assault. In command bunkers, radios crackled with status reports and updates from higher headquarters. Throughout the base, soldiers made final checks of weapons and equipment, knowing that their lives and the lives of their fellow defenders might depend on details that seemed routine just hours before. The storm was coming, and everyone could feel it in the air, taste it in their fear and anticipation. Soon, the men and women of FOB Sentinel would discover what they were truly made of, and among them, a cook who had served quietly for 18 months was about to remind everyone that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places when everything depends on doing what's right, regardless of the cost.
The first explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence at exactly 0347 hours.
Sullivan felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as he lay in his defensive position near the eastern perimeter, the shockwave rolling across the base like an invisible tide of destruction. The blast had come from beyond the wire, a massive improvised explosive device designed to breach the outer defenses and signal the beginning of the assault everyone had been dreading. Within seconds, the night erupted in a symphony of violence that transformed FOB Sentinel from a sleeping military outpost into a battlefield where survival would depend on training, courage, and split-second decisions. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the darkness like deadly fireworks, their fiery trails painting brief, terrifying pictures against the star-filled sky. Small arms fire erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixing with the heavier reports of sniper rifles and machine guns. Sullivan keyed his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos with the calm professionalism that had kept him alive through countless firefights. Alpha Team, this is 6. Contact East Perimeter. Multiple hostiles advancing through the breach. Moving to engage. The SEAL team's response was immediate and coordinated, each member moving to predetermined positions with the fluid efficiency that comes from years of training and absolute trust in each other's abilities. The Taliban assault was more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. Instead of the typical human wave attacks that characterized many of their operations, this was a carefully orchestrated military operation designed to exploit every weakness in FOB Sentinel's defenses. Diversionary attacks from the north and west drew defenders' attention while the main assault force advanced through the breach created by the initial explosion. Mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter with deadly accuracy, suggesting that enemy spotters had been observing the base's layout for weeks or even months. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the command frequency, cutting through the noise of battle with urgent updates and tactical instructions. All units, this is Sentinel Base. We have multiple breaches confirmed.
Echo and Foxtrot squads fall back to secondary positions. Medical, prepare for mass casualties.
This is not a drill. The Eastern Guard Tower, which had taken a direct hit from an RPG, was already engulfed in flames. The two soldiers who had been manning the position were nowhere to be seen, their fate a grim reminder of how quickly the tide of battle could turn. Sullivan could see enemy fighters advancing through the breach, their movements coordinated and purposeful despite the defensive fire being directed against them. These weren't the poorly trained militia fighters that American forces had sometimes faced in other engagements. These were experienced combatants who understood modern battlefield tactics. Throughout the base, individual acts of courage began to emerge, as soldiers overcame their initial shock and responded with the professionalism their training had instilled. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a combat medic with the 10th Mountain Division, sprinted across open ground under heavy fire to reach wounded soldiers in the damaged eastern sector, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she dodged between concrete barriers and abandoned equipment. Despite the bullets whining past her head and the explosions that seemed to follow her every step, Santos moved with the determined purpose of someone who understood that her actions might mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. The base's ammunition depot had become a critical vulnerability. Located near the center of the compound, it contained enough explosives to level half the base if it were to detonate. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, found himself trapped near the depot when a group of Taliban fighters broke through the southern perimeter. With enemy forces advancing and friendly defenders falling back, Mitchell made the split-second decision to remain at his position, using his knowledge of explosives to create improvised defensive measures that might slow the enemy advance. Chen heard the battle begin from the dining facility, where he had been making coffee and preparing breakfast for the early morning guard shift change. The first explosion knocked him to his knees, sending pots and pans crashing to the floor around him. For a moment, muscle memory from his Marine Corps days took over, and he found himself automatically conducting the immediate action drills that had been drilled into him during infantry training years ago. Get down, assess the situation, identify threats, take appropriate action. The dining facility's windows had been blown out by the concussion from nearby explosions, and Chen could see muzzle flashes and tracer rounds crisscrossing the base's interior. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with enemy fighters apparently having penetrated the outer defenses in multiple locations. From his position, Chen could see American soldiers falling back from forward positions, some carrying wounded comrades, others simply trying to reach cover before enemy fire could find them. Chen's combat instincts, dormant but never completely forgotten, began to reassert themselves. He moved through the damaged dining facility with the cautious efficiency of an experienced infantryman, checking corners and maintaining awareness of potential threats. His years as a cook had given him an intimate knowledge of the base's layout, including service corridors and maintenance areas that most military personnel never saw. This knowledge, combined with his combat experience, made him uniquely qualified to move through the base even as the battle raged around him. The first wounded soldier appeared at the dining facility's entrance just as Chen was trying to assess the tactical situation outside. Private First Class David Kim, barely 19 years old, and assigned to the base's communications section, stumbled through the doorway with blood streaming down his face and his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through his position, killing his buddy and leaving Kim disoriented and seeking shelter. Chen didn't hesitate. His Marine Corps training included combat first aid, and he quickly guided Kim to a relatively protected area, near the kitchen's serving counter. Using dish towels and medical supplies from the facility's first aid kit, Chen began treating the young soldier's wounds while simultaneously trying to gather information about the battle's progress. Kim was in shock, his words coming in fragments that painted a picture of defensive positions being overrun and American forces struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of a well-coordinated enemy assault. Outside, the battle was reaching a critical phase. Sullivan and his SEAL team had managed to slow the enemy advance through the eastern breach, but they were heavily outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The Taliban fighters showed no signs of backing down, seemingly willing to accept heavy casualties in order to achieve their objective of overrunning the base. Radio communications were becoming increasingly frantic as unit commanders reported positions being abandoned and defensive lines collapsing under sustained enemy pressure. The base's command center, located in a reinforced bunker near the center of the compound, had become the focal point of American resistance. Captain Rodriguez and her staff were working frantically to coordinate defensive actions while simultaneously calling for immediate air support and medical evacuation for the mounting casualties. The weather that had grounded aircraft the previous day was finally beginning to clear, but help was still hours away at best.
Chen realized that his location in the dining facility provided him with a unique vantage point for observing enemy movements through the base's interior. The building's central location and multiple windows gave him sightlines to several critical areas, including approaches to the command center and ammunition depot. As more wounded soldiers began arriving at his improvised aid station, Chen found himself in the unexpected position of coordinating information about enemy positions and movements.
"There's a group of them moving between the maintenance sheds," Chen reported to Sergeant Santos when she arrived with 2 more wounded soldiers. "Looks like they're trying to work around behind the command center." Santos nodded grimly, her medical training temporarily taking precedence over tactical concerns as she helped Chen treat the increasing number of casualties arriving at their location. The dining facility was transforming into something between a field hospital and a fortress. Chen had moved tables and equipment to create defensive positions near the windows, while the kitchen's large refrigerators and commercial cooking equipment provided additional protection from small arms fire. The building's solid construction offered more protection than many other locations on the base, making it a natural rally point for wounded personnel and soldiers who had been cut off from their units. Sullivan's voice crackled over the radio with increasing urgency as his team's situation became more desperate. "Sentinel Base Alpha 6, we're taking heavy casualties and running critically low on ammunition. Request immediate resupply and reinforcement at Grid 41S Maryland 12345. 67890. The response from the command center was immediate but not encouraging. All available personnel were already committed to defensive positions, and the ammunition depot was under direct enemy fire.
It was then that Chen made a decision that would change the course of the battle. During his 18 months at FOB Sentinel, his duties as head cook had given him access to areas of the base that most military personnel never saw. The service tunnels and maintenance corridors that connected various buildings included a route that led directly to the ammunition depot's loading dock. More importantly, Chen knew that there was a secondary storage area near the kitchen that contained emergency supplies, including ammunition that had been stockpiled for exactly this type of situation.
"I can get ammunition to Sullivan's team," Chen told Santos during a brief lull in the fighting. "I know a route through the service corridors that should avoid most of the enemy positions." Santos looked at him with surprise, suddenly seeing the stocky cook in a completely different light. "You sure about this? That's a combat mission and you're not exactly equipped for it." Chen checked the M4 carbine he had retrieved from one of the wounded soldiers who no longer needed it. His hands moved over the weapon with the familiarity of someone who had carried similar firearms through 2 combat tours in Iraq. "I was infantry before I was a cook," he said simply. "And right now, those guys need ammunition more than they need breakfast." The route to the ammunition depot would take Chen through parts of the base that were under direct enemy observation and fire. The Taliban fighters had established positions that commanded key approaches, and several American attempts to reach critical supply points had already failed with heavy casualties. But Chen's knowledge of the base's hidden infrastructure gave him options that other defenders didn't have. Moving through the service corridor beneath the dining facility, Chen found himself in a concrete-lined tunnel that he had walked dozens of times during routine maintenance checks and supply runs. The familiar environment felt surreal now, transformed by the sounds of battle echoing through the walls and ceiling above. Explosions and gunfire created a constant background noise that made it difficult to determine exactly where the fighting was most intense. The secondary storage area contained exactly what Chen had hoped to find: cases of 5.56 mm ammunition, grenades and other supplies that had been pre-positioned for emergency situations. Loading as much as he could carry, Chen began the dangerous journey towards Sullivan's position, moving through corridors and maintenance areas that most of the base's personnel didn't even know existed. The SEAL team's situation had become desperate. 3 of Sullivan's 8 men were wounded, including one who was unconscious and bleeding badly from a head wound. Their defensive position was being hammered by concentrated enemy fire, and Taliban fighters were maneuvering to flank their location. Without immediate resupply, Sullivan knew that his team would be overrun within minutes. Chen emerged from a maintenance hatch less than 50 meters from Sullivan's position, but those 50 meters might as well have been 50 miles given the intensity of enemy fire crossing the open ground between them. The cook-turned-infantry soldier studied the tactical situation with the same careful attention he had once applied to meal preparation, looking for patterns and opportunities that might allow him to reach the SEALs without being killed in the attempt. The solution came from an unexpected source. A damaged fuel truck that had been hit by mortar fire was burning nearby, creating a thick cloud of black smoke that obscured visibility across a significant portion of the battlefield. If Chen could time his movement correctly, the smoke might provide enough concealment to reach Sullivan's position. Taking a deep breath, Chen sprinted from his covered position toward the SEAL team's location, his body bent low, and his movements erratic to avoid presenting an easy target for enemy snipers. The weight of the ammunition he was carrying made the run more difficult,
But his determination to reach his fellow Americans drove him forward despite the bullets that seemed to fill the air around him. Sullivan saw Chen coming and couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The base's cook was sprinting across open ground under heavy enemy fire, carrying what appeared to be badly needed ammunition resupply. Without hesitation, Sullivan and his remaining effective team members laid down suppressive fire to cover Chen's approach, their bullets forcing enemy fighters to seek cover just as the former Marine dove into their defensive position. "Figured you guys might need this," Chen panted, distributing ammunition magazines and grenades to the grateful SEALs.
Sullivan looked at the older man with new respect, suddenly understanding that there was much more to Tommy Chen than anyone had realized. "How the hell did you get here without getting killed?" Chen's grin was that of a combat veteran who had just successfully completed a dangerous mission.
18 months of walking around this place, checking on deliveries and taking smoke breaks. Amazing what you notice when you're paying attention. His casual tone belied the significance of what he had just accomplished, but there was no time for extended conversation. The battle was far from over, and the ammunition Chen had brought would only buy them a temporary reprieve. The resupply allowed Sullivan's team to resume effective defensive fire, but the tactical situation remained critical. Enemy forces were continuing to pour through multiple breaches in the base's perimeter, and American defenders were being forced to fall back to increasingly compact defensive positions. The command center was calling for air support with increasing desperation, but atmospheric conditions were still preventing close air support aircraft from reaching their location. Chen realized that his unique knowledge of the base's infrastructure could be used for more than just ammunition runs. The service corridors and maintenance tunnels that connected various buildings could potentially allow small groups of defenders to move undetected, enabling them to conduct flanking maneuvers against enemy positions. More importantly, these hidden routes could be used to evacuate wounded personnel and establish defensive positions in areas that the Taliban fighters might not expect to encounter resistance. As the battle entered its third hour, it became clear that the fight for FOB Sentinel would be decided by small unit actions and individual acts of courage rather than large-scale tactical maneuvers. The confined nature of the base's defensive positions had turned the engagement into a series of close-quarters battles where personal weapon skills and determination mattered more than numerical superiority. In this environment, experience and adaptability became the decisive factors that separated survivors from casualties. Chen found himself moving back and forth between different defensive positions, using his knowledge of the base to coordinate supply runs and information sharing between isolated units. His transformation from cook to combat coordinator happened naturally, driven by the immediate needs of the situation and his instinctive understanding of small unit tactics. The man who had served breakfast to these same soldiers just hours before was now helping to coordinate their fight for survival. The dining facility had become an unofficial command post for the base's interior defense, with Chen serving as a de facto intelligence coordinator due to his mobility and situational awareness. Wounded soldiers arriving at his location brought information about enemy positions and movements, creating a picture of the battlefield that was often more current and accurate than what was available to the official command center. As dawn began to break over FOB Sentinel, the intensity of the fighting showed no signs of decreasing. If anything, the growing light was allowing both sides to engage targets with greater accuracy, escalating the lethality of the ongoing battle. The Taliban assault had evolved from a coordinated military operation into a grinding attrition fight where success would ultimately depend on which side could maintain its will to fight despite mounting casualties and depleted supplies. Dawn brought no relief to the defenders of FOB Sentinel. If anything, the increasing light revealed the desperate nature of their situation more clearly than the darkness had allowed. Enemy fighters had penetrated deep into the base's interior, establishing positions among the buildings and supply areas that had seemed secure just hours before. The carefully planned defensive positions that had looked so solid on paper were proving inadequate against an enemy willing to accept massive casualties in pursuit of their objective.
Chen moved through the base's service corridors with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had found his calling in the midst of chaos. His improvised role as intelligence coordinator and supply runner had evolved into something approaching battlefield command, as isolated groups of defenders began relying on his knowledge and tactical instincts to coordinate their actions. The dining facility had become the unofficial nerve center for the interior defense, with Chen serving as the critical link between separated units. The base's official command center was still functioning, but enemy fire had severed several key communication lines and forced Captain Rodriguez and her staff to operate from a backup facility with limited visibility of the overall tactical situation. In the absence of centralized command and control, small unit leaders were making independent decisions based on incomplete information, leading to gaps in the defense that the enemy was quick to exploit. Sullivan's SEAL team had managed to hold their position through the night, largely due to the ammunition resupply that Chen had delivered under fire. But their situation remained precarious, with enemy forces maneuvering to surround their defensive position while maintaining constant pressure from multiple directions. The team's casualties were mounting, and Sullivan knew that, without significant reinforcement or air support, they would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was during this critical phase of the battle that Chen made an observation that would prove to be the turning point in FOB Sentinel's defense. While moving between positions to coordinate supply runs, he noticed something that the official intelligence reports had missed. The Taliban assault force was receiving coordinated direction from a single location within the base's perimeter.
During his months as head cook, Chen had observed the daily routines and movement patterns of everyone at FOB Sentinel. His duties required him to interact with personnel from every unit and section, giving him an understanding of normal operations that few others possessed. When he noticed radio communications equipment in an area where it shouldn't have been, and personnel who were supposed to be in defensive positions moving freely through areas under enemy fire, Chen realized that FOB Sentinel's defenses had been compromised from within. The discovery was as shocking as it was dangerous.
Someone inside the base was providing the Taliban attackers with real-time intelligence about defensive positions, supply routes, and tactical plans. This explained why enemy fire had been so accurate, why defensive positions had been flanked so quickly, and why every attempt to coordinate a counterattack had been met with precisely targeted enemy responses. Chen's military experience told him that confronting the suspected insider directly would be both dangerous and potentially ineffective. Instead, he began a careful process of verification, using his mobility and access to observe the suspected individual while simultaneously developing a plan to neutralize the threat without alerting other potential collaborators.
The process required patience and tactical thinking, qualities that Chen had developed during his infantry service and refined through years of managing complex food service operations.
The suspected insider was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a communications specialist who had been assigned to FOB Sentinel for 8 months. Webb's position gave him access to tactical communications and operational plans, making him an ideal source of intelligence for enemy forces.
More concerning was the realization that Webb's access to communication systems could allow him to intercept and redirect critical messages, explaining why several requests for air support and medical evacuation had apparently never reached higher headquarters. Chen's plan to neutralize the insider threat required careful coordination with the base's remaining loyal personnel, but the chaos of ongoing combat made normal communication procedures impossible. Instead, Chen used his knowledge of the service corridors to move undetected through the base, making contact with key individuals who could help verify his suspicions and coordinate appropriate action. Sergeant Santos was the first person Chen approached with his concerns. The combat medic's position at the impromptu aid station in the dining facility had given her visibility of personnel movements throughout the battle, and she confirmed several of Chen's observations about Webb's suspicious behavior. More importantly, Santos had the medical training and battlefield experience necessary to understand the tactical implications of having an enemy agent embedded within their defensive operations. The decision to act on Chen's intelligence came when intercepted enemy radio communications revealed detailed knowledge of a planned counterattack that had been discussed only in the base's command center. Sullivan's SEAL team was being maneuvered into a carefully prepared ambush based on information that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of operational planning. The insider's intelligence was about to get the base's most experienced fighters killed. Chen and Santos developed a plan that leveraged their unique positions within the base's improvised command structure. Chen would continue his intelligence gathering while Santos used her medical authority to restrict Webb's access to critical areas under the pretense of treating wounded personnel. The plan required precise timing and absolute secrecy, as any indication that Webb's activities had been discovered could result in immediate retaliation against American personnel. The confrontation came as Webb was preparing to transmit another intelligence update to his Taliban contacts. Chen had positioned himself in a service corridor adjacent to the communication center, using his knowledge of the building's layout to approach undetected. Santos had created a medical emergency requiring Webb's immediate assistance, drawing him away from his radio equipment at the critical moment when Chen could intercept his communications. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Webb's radio was tuned to frequencies being used by Taliban command elements, and his coded transmissions contained detailed information about American defensive positions and planned tactical movements. When confronted with the evidence, Webb's reaction confirmed Chen's suspicions. Instead of surprise or confusion, the communications specialist displayed the calculating alertness of someone whose cover had been blown. Webb's capture revealed the extent to which FOB Sentinel's defenses had been compromised.
For months, he had been providing Taliban forces with detailed intelligence about base operations, personnel movements, and tactical capabilities. His information had allowed enemy planners to develop the sophisticated assault plan that had nearly succeeded in overrunning the American position.
More disturbing was the discovery that Webb had been sabotaging communication attempts to call for air support and reinforcement, deliberately isolating the base during its most vulnerable period. With the insider threat neutralized, Chen turned his attention to using Webb's communication equipment to deceive the enemy forces that had been relying on his intelligence.
Working with Santos and other personnel who had gathered at the dining facility, Chen began transmitting false information designed to lure Taliban fighters into prepared ambush positions. The plan required careful coordination with the base's remaining defensive elements, but Chen's knowledge of enemy positions and movements made it possible to execute complex deception operations.
The first deception involved convincing Taliban commanders that the SEAL team's position had been abandoned, encouraging them to advance into an area where Sullivan and his men were prepared to engage them at close quarters. The success of this operation not only relieved pressure on the SEALs but also allowed them to launch their own counterattack against enemy positions that had been threatening the base's ammunition depot.
Chen's transformation from cook to tactical coordinator reached its culmination as he began directing defensive operations from his position in the dining facility. His intimate knowledge of the base's layout, combined with intelligence gathered from wounded personnel and his own observations, gave him a better understanding of the overall tactical situation than anyone else still alive and operational. Despite having no official authority, Chen found himself making decisions that affected the lives of everyone at FOB Sentinel. The base's defense began to coalesce around Chen's improvised command center, with isolated units coordinating their actions through the intelligence network he had established.
Supply runs that had been impossible under enemy observation became feasible when coordinated through the service corridors and maintenance tunnels that Chen knew better than anyone else. Wounded personnel who had been trapped in exposed positions were evacuated through routes that Chen had mapped during his months of routine duties.
Sullivan's SEAL team, reinforced with ammunition and intelligence provided by Chen's network, began conducting offensive operations against enemy positions that had been identified through the dining facility's intelligence gathering efforts. The team's tactical expertise, combined with Chen's strategic knowledge of the battlefield, created a synergy that allowed a handful of American fighters to begin turning the tide against numerically superior enemy forces.
The turning point came when Chen coordinated a complex operation to retake the base's eastern perimeter. Using his knowledge of Taliban positions gained through intercepted communications and direct observation, Chen directed a three-pronged attack that caught enemy fighters in a coordinated crossfire.
The operation required precise timing and flawless communication between separated units, capabilities that had been impossible before Chen's intelligence network was established. As morning progressed into afternoon, the sounds of battle began to change. The constant crack of enemy small arms fire was increasingly answered by the distinctive reports of American weapons as defensive positions were re-established and lost ground was recaptured. Taliban fighters who had penetrated deep into the base's interior found themselves cut off from their supply lines and exposed to counterattacks coordinated through Chen's communication network.
The arrival of close air support aircraft, finally able to reach FOB Sentinel as weather conditions improved, marked the beginning of the end for the Taliban assault force.
But the air support was only effective because Chen's intelligence network could provide accurate target information and coordinate ground operations with the attacking aircraft. Without this capability, the air support might have been ineffective or even dangerous to friendly forces operating in close proximity to enemy positions.
Chen's coordination of the base's defense during the final phase of the battle demonstrated capabilities that surprised everyone who had known him only as a cook. His tactical decisions showed an understanding of complex military operations that exceeded what might be expected from someone with his official qualifications. More importantly, his leadership during the crisis revealed character traits that had been hidden during months of routine peacetime operations. The battle for FOB Sentinel officially ended when the last organized enemy resistance was eliminated late in the afternoon. Taliban fighters who had not been killed or captured during the counterattack operations withdrew from the area, leaving behind equipment and casualties that testified to the ferocity of the engagement. American casualties were significant but far lower than they might have been without the tactical coordination that Chen had provided during the most critical phases of the battle.
In the aftermath of the fighting, as medical evacuation helicopters landed to remove the wounded and forensic teams began investigating the insider threat that had nearly caused the base's fall, Chen quietly returned to his duties in the dining facility. The dining room was damaged, equipment was destroyed, and supplies were scattered, but Chen began the process of restoration with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his approach to combat operations.
The official after-action reports would document the tactical details of FOB Sentinel's successful defense, noting the effective coordination between different units and the successful identification and neutralization of the insider threat.
But those reports could not capture the human dimension of what had occurred. How one man's quiet competence and hidden capabilities had emerged during a crisis to save lives and preserve a strategic position.
Sullivan found Chen cleaning up the dining facility several hours after the last shots had been fired. The SEAL Master Chief had come to express his gratitude for the ammunition resupply that had allowed his team to survive the night. But what he found was something more profound.
Chen was not seeking recognition or praise for his actions. He was simply returning to the work that gave his life meaning, serving the soldiers who depended on him for sustenance and support. "You saved a lot of lives today," Sullivan said as he watched Chen methodically inventorying damaged equipment and planning repairs. "You realize that, don't you?" Chen looked up from his work, his expression reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done what needed to be done without regard for personal recognition. "I just did what any Marine would do," he replied.
"Take care of the guys fighting next to you. Everything else is just details."
Captain Rodriguez's commendation recommendation would describe Chen's actions in terms of exceptional valor and tactical brilliance, noting his identification of the insider threat, coordination of intelligence operations and leadership during critical phases of the battle. But for Chen himself, the recognition was less important than the knowledge that he had served honorably when his fellow Americans needed him most. The dining facility reopened 3 days later, serving meals prepared by a cook whose reputation had been forever changed by events that revealed character traits hidden beneath years of quiet service. Soldiers who had known Chen only as the man who prepared their meals now understood that they had been living alongside a warrior whose capabilities extended far beyond the kitchen.
But Chen himself seemed unchanged, approaching his duties with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his work before the battle. The true measure of Chen's impact became apparent in the weeks and months following the battle for FOB Sentinel.
The base's defensive procedures were revised to incorporate lessons learned from his tactical innovations, and his intelligence-gathering methods became part of the standard operating procedures for similar installations. More importantly, his example demonstrated that heroism could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded extraordinary action from ordinary people.
The insider threat investigation revealed the extent to which Webb's betrayal had compromised FOB Sentinel's security, but it also highlighted the importance of the kind of situational awareness that Chen had developed through months of careful observation. His ability to notice anomalies and patterns that others had missed became a model for identifying similar threats at other installations, potentially saving countless lives through improved security procedures.
Chen's story spread beyond FOB Sentinel as word of his actions reached other military installations and eventually the broader military community. But the man himself remained focused on his duties, continuing to serve meals and maintain his kitchen with the same dedication that had characterized his approach to combat operations. For Tommy Chen, the battle had simply been another form of service, another way of taking care of the soldiers who depended on him. Years later, when veterans of FOB Sentinel gathered to remember their experiences, they would speak of many acts of courage and sacrifice that occurred during that desperate night and day. But invariably, conversations would turn to the cook who had emerged from the kitchen to become the tactical coordinator whose actions had saved them all. In their memories, Chen represented something fundamental about military service: the understanding that heroism is not defined by rank or position, but by the willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect the people fighting beside you. The dining facility at FOB Sentinel eventually returned to normal operations, serving 3 meals a day to soldiers whose duties kept them far from home. But the kitchen would never again be seen as just a place where food was prepared. It had become a symbol of how ordinary service could be transformed into extraordinary heroism when the situation demanded it, and how the qualities that made someone good at their daily job could also make them capable of actions that defied every expectation and saved lives when everything was on the line.